This is video 1 of week 3, Theories of Language Acquisition. So our point of departure to study the phenomenon of multilingualism is going to be how one becomes multilingual. So humans, when they are born, obviously they are non-linguistic beings, and then they become linguistic beings. They learn a language. That is called the process of language acquisition, which happens as you mature. Now, I'm going to start not by telling you about how the differences between acquiring one language versus acquiring more than one language. That will be next week. First, we have to understand what are the approaches that the scientific community has designed to understand how humans acquire a language at all, how they become linguistic beings. This is why this week is called Theories of Language Acquisition in general. So the point of departure is what we call the acquisition mystery. And that is the simple observation that the underlying logic of language is not immediately given on the surface of the utterance that it determines, but must somehow be inferred. What that means is that when we are exposed to linguistic stimuli, it is only the tip of the iceberg of the linguistic architecture. So we know, because you have taken all these introduction to linguistic classes, perhaps, that when you encounter any kind of linguistic form, a word, a sound, a sentence, any piece of linguistic meaning, you are only seeing the tip of an iceberg, which is the whole set of grammatical rules that are responsible for that linguistic object to have that shape and not other. And finding out those principles, finding out the grammar of a language is not a trivial task. It's hard for us to be aware of what grammatical principles determine our language. And you know that because if you have tried to draw a syntactic tree from a sentence, you know that didn't come naturally. It took you some work. Nevertheless, you know that you have that knowledge. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to use the language that you are analyzing. So that is the challenge. The challenge is, how do children infer all of those grammatical rules from just the visible part of language, which is not straightforwardly pointing out at those structures. And in spite of this difficulty, every child learns its native language over the first year of life, first 1 to 3 years of life, when other seemingly simpler analytic tasks are well beyond its reach. So they are able to start understanding at least the phonetics, phonology, some morphology principles in the first year, when they can't even button their shirts or walk in a proficient way. And nevertheless, this incredible task of finding out what are the structural principles of language, they manage, no matter how many languages they have to analyze, and no matter how that language looks like. And children do that without special guidance or reinforcement. It is not the case that parents sit their child there and tell them, okay, kid, these are the morphological principles of your language, or these are the syntactic structures of your language, or anything like that. They don't have explicit guidance, and they have very little reinforcement. We tell them, yes, that's good, that's bad, but normally we just speak to the child, and the child is in charge of finding out the rules on their own. They also do it on schedule. You look across languages, and children follow a very particular schedule. They first learn the phonology of it, then the morphology of it, then within the specific morphology, they have a schedule of features that they learn one after the other, that is relative to the language, but is also universal to a certain extent. So they just have a schedule that is very similar to any other biological schedule that humans go through, for example, puberty or aging of any kind, and including menopause or losing your hair or something like that. So there seems to be something biological about it, about this schedule of maturation in which, other things being equal, that humans go through. So for language also, there seems to be a universal schedule to a certain extent that we can identify. It's also remarkable that children learn this or acquire language with a quite an incredible dissociation from general intelligence. It's true that obviously there are children that focus on language earlier than others, so they look like they are acquiring the language earlier than others. That happens also with other things like walking. There are children that walk earlier than others or are able to read earlier than others. So children are able to focus their attention on specific ability at a given time. But in general, other things being equal, it's not necessarily linked to general intelligence. So children that are very high on some kind of intelligence not always go faster in their acquisition of language. Sometimes they do. Now, children that also acquire language early, it's not always an indicator of having a higher intelligence by other parameters later on or confirmed later on. And of course, we have the case of some neurological syndromes, very notably Williams syndrome. You can actually Google that and take a look. Those are people that are incredible beings, mental beings, because they are incredibly chatty and nice and social and have developed language perfectly well and on schedule and in a very remarkable way. But nevertheless, the rest of cognitive abilities that they show seem to be not at the level of their language proficiency. So they are unable to count, for example, or to do very simple mathematical operations, even within age-appropriate standards. They are very good at language and music, specifically, but they don't seem to be equally remarkable about other cognitive abilities. So that tells you that the acquisition of language might be quite dissociated from the acquisition or the development of other cognitive abilities. It seems to be its own thing. So, of course, the question then is, how do they do it? How do children in these circumstances acquire language in the way they do? And that is the basic question. That's what it means to study language acquisition, is to study how children acquire language. Okay, so that's the question. How do children acquire language? And the range of theories of language acquisition polarize around a divide between structural and functional theories of language. This is a divide that you have seen before. So it is at the grammatical level, and it is also then at the language acquisition level. Yeah? Oops. So the structural theories of language acquisition, they focus on the abstract underlying structure of language, while the functional theories of language acquisition, they focus on the context in which language is used. So structure is all about how do children acquire the architectural principles of language. That's the structural approach. And the functional approach is how do children know how to function linguistically? How do they learn to put the linguistic ability in practice? And of course, you know me again, that I think that probably the right theory will be one that takes both approaches into consideration, that it is a yin and yang balance between acquiring the structural principles of language and knowing how to use it. So these different approaches to the question of language acquisition manifest themselves into taking a stand about other more overarching theoretical questions while they study the process, right? The first question, for example, is how does language relate to other cognitive abilities in the mind and in the brain? This is whether you take a structural approach or whether you take a functional approach. you will have different answers to that. The two possibilities is that language has its own place in the brain that is separated from other cognitive abilities. We call that the modularity or the independent theory of language representation in the brain. The alternative is that the brain is instead an all-purpose organ that has cognitive abilities and that it produces many cognitive products, so to speak. And one of them will be language, another one will be the ability to interpret color or visual stimuli or auditory stimuli or theory of mind, etc. But they all respond to the same principles that the brain is able to produce, and not a modularity vision of the mind in which each one of those cognitive abilities would be embodied in the brain separately and to a certain independence of each other. Right. So the structural theories of language acquisition, the ones that focus on how you acquire the structural principles, the architectural principles, the grammars of the language, they tend to line themselves along the ideas of a modularity idea of the brain, a modularity conception of the mind and of the brain eventually. While the functional theories, the ones that are focused on how one uses language, those are very much aligning themselves normally on a dependent, on an all-purpose idea of the brain. The second question is, what's the role of linguistic input from the for the acquisition of language? How much does it mind the kind of input that the child gets in order to develop language? And here you have also two ideas that you might encounter. One is the idea of the poverty of the stimulus, meaning that very little input go a long way. And the other one is that you need a lot of input and you just do statistical analysis of that input, and then you actually input is more important than it appears. We will see those later when I explain to you the different theories. But the structural theories tend to be more aligning themselves towards the poverty of the stimulus idea, that the input is just a token, has a token influence on developing language, while the functional theories align themselves more with the idea that the brain is just basically a statistical machine that computes input. Therefore, the input has enormous significance for that computation, and that's how humans basically acquire language. The third question is, how is linguistic knowledge represented in the mind? It's a little bit like the first question, but it has its own flavor. And here you have structural theories aligning themselves with thinking that language is represented in the mind, and this representation idea of the brain is very questionable, but it's just a metaphor for our purposes. But language is just represented in the mind as a set of abstract rules. So you have rules that produce linguistic structures, versus the functional theory is more comfortable with having language represented in the mind as inventories of specific knowledge. So more as lists of possible structures, for example, instead of a list of possible rules. Now, this is in general terms how the scientific inquiry of language acquisition is structured. You have the lions of the so this is, in general terms, how the scientific study of language acquisition is structured. Now, it is hard to find scholars that align very definedly and on all kinds of parameters on one side of the inquiry versus another side of the inquiry. So if you allow me to make a simile here, you would find someone who identifies themselves as a prototypical representative of one kind of theory or of another kind of theory, but you find also in academia and in scientific community, you find many examples of mixed theories in which they take components that traditionally belong more to a structural approach to language acquisition, or they belong to a functional approach of language acquisition, but they mix them with ideas or with concessions for both ways to look at the process. Okay, so many theories are aligned perfectly in one category, but many theories actually and many scholars accept that maybe the truth is after all in the middle. Eventually, what happens though is that there is human limitation in scientific inquiry. So what happens very often is very reminiscent of that story of Rudyard Kipling, in which there are 10 blind Indians that are asked to approach an elephant, and only by their subjective experience of the elephant to describe how the elephant is. So each individual, and remember these are blind individuals, so they cannot see, they can only touch and smell and maybe I don't know, hear, whatever other senses they have, but they cannot see the elephant. But they approach the elephant and they are put in front of the animal in different places of the animal. So one gets the trunk, and the other one gets the ear, and the other one gets the foot, and the other one gets kind of the body, and the other one gets the tail, and so on. And then when they are asked to describe how an elephant looks like, each one of them describes the elephant according to their own subjective experience. So what they come out with is something like this. So the one who got the trunk would say, well, an elephant, yeah, I can tell you how an elephant looks like. An elephant is just like a giant python snake. And another one who got the ear would say, oh, well, an elephant, I'll tell you what it looks like. It looks like an enormous fan. And another one would say an elephant is like an enormous brick wall. And the other one say, no, it's like a rope, and so forth. So each of the individuals will describe the elephant according to the experience that they have had of the elephant. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because I think it's a good metaphor to understand that in the scientific community something very similar happens. So when you are looking at a particular phenomenon, and there is an inevitable specialization that you have about that particular phenomenon, and if you look at it so closely, you might lose sight or perspective about the rest of the phenomenon. So imagine that you're looking at syntactic structures. So because the structural part of them is so prominent, you might think that the whole of language is a big structure, like you thought that the whole of elephant was a trunk or a python like element. So that happens also in science, that sometimes your point of view determines your idea or your claims about how the whole looks like. So always keep in mind that many times you will read about ideas about what the language look like, and those ideas will be influenced by the particular perspective that a scholar has on that.